Free Pride was invited to attend a seminar that took place earlier on in the month of April. The Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, hosted the event titled Heteral Nationalism, Homonormativity, and the Problem of Sexual Citizenship in Trinidad and Tobago. Independent scholar, lecturer, and published author Keith McNeil, as he walks us through the political, legal, and cultural climate that exists within TNT.
To a large extent. And the argument is that post-colonial West Indian nationalist projects have engaged in a process of heterosexualization, active heterosexualization of the legal code, of political discourse. And the corollary, the flip side of that endeavor has been the kind of progressive, specific othering of the homosexual as the other to the heterosexist, kind of heteronationalist kind of project. And as we'll see in the cases of legislative reform and legal changes in political discourse, the emphasis, the sort of heteronationalist emphasis is an emphasis on a progressive, specific, kind of focused emphasis on procreative, reproductive, heterosexual conjugality, and the expansion and sort of upregulation of that as sort of at the heart of producing proper citizens. And so therefore, reproductive heterosexual conjugality as the locus of national development and progress. And we'll look at the ways that this has manifested in a series of registers. So in other words, citizenship has become predicated in the post-colonial period, has become increasingly predicated on an emphasis on correct, legitimate, respectable sex and the policing and regulation of proper sexuality, which in turn delegitimates sexual citizenship and sexual rights for queer folks. You know, I'll just use that kind of loosely to include lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, although it's complicated if we were going to focus on each population or group of people, group of experiences. But what this does is this said, because the rules of the game have become progressively heteronationalist, it creates pressure, a pressure towards what I would call homonormativity. The idea that in order to get rights to play the game, you actually have to play the game according to the heteronationalist paradigm that's set out. So that means, you know, an emphasis on straight acting. You know, this is not, probably many of you are familiar with this kind of idea, but it does create this kind of pressure for homonormativity, creating a kind of political double bind for activists, for queer folks who are interested in change and in their own citizenship rights. And it also displaces and marginalizes those who are excluded from the homonormative kind of framework. So this is kind of the analytic arc of what we're dealing with, but I want to sort of take you in a very detailed, careful, systematic way through the case of Trinidad and Tobago. And then I want to end by reflecting on what I think is a kind of interesting, relatively unique aspect of resistance to sexual citizenship rights for queer folk, specifically in the post-colonial West Indies and in Trinidad and Tobago in particular. And in this instance, at the end, I'm actually comparing it with the United States, where it's a little bit different. I think more complicated here. The resistance to the kind of heteronationalist imperative and its resistance to progressive change on this front. Okay, so let's think about the colonial legal code, the colonial Caribbean set of laws. What you need to know is that colonial legislation targeted all forms of non-procreative sex as unnatural. And it did not, one of the critical things is that it did not focus on homosexuality per se. It focused on anything that wasn't procreative, that didn't, didn't reproduce children. So it included homosexuality, of course. But it also included married people, and it did not, the issue of consent was irrelevant, which is interesting as we get into the late 20th century period where debates and legislative issues having to do with consent and sexual violence and all these things becomes very, very, very important. The colonial West Indian laws in this regard also applied to adults and minors alike. There wasn't the distinction between adults and minors was not as salient as it became later. Penalties for what were known as buggery were especially harsh in the 19th century, but they were gradually relaxed turning into the 20th century. They were gradually relaxed. And again, this is salient for talking about what then happens later in the 20th century here. In this context, the kind of late colonial decolonizing movements or sentiments, the kind of gathering force and the emergence of a kind of anti-colonial, decolonizing, nationalist project or proto-project, we might say, over time came to focus more and more on working and lower class forms of reproduction as a kind of privileged site for the redemption of the masses in order to produce proper citizens, right? To create kind of legitimate, to approximate respectability and to create citizens out of, the kind of, morass of concubinage and illegitimate children and, you know that whole story. So, but what I'm trying to focus on and pull out here for our attention is that, so in a sense, reforming reproduction and reforming forms of heterosexual pair bonding became an important site for redeeming the colonial population and producing a proper nationalism with proper citizens. This, of course, built on the Euro-colonial preoccupation with unnatural sex, to be sure, but decolonizing West Indian nationalisms increasingly upregulated a specifically heterosexual, heterosexist focus on forms of reproduction, kinship, and social relations. So late colonial and early post-colonial marriage laws were under constant revision, and what happened was, over time, what were, before that point, extra-legal forms of conjugality, what we now know as common law marriages and also visiting relationships, for example, those progressively were sort of, those were encompassed within the orbit of proper marriage, in closer proximity to what was considered proper, respectable marriage. And these laws, the expansion of the orbit of legitimate conjugal heterosexual relations were expanded over the course of the 20th century. So in other words, the legal code reproduced and reified the notion of non-reproductive sexual practice as unnatural and perverse, while categories of legitimate conjugality were being broadened to include more and more forms of reproductive heterosexual union. And as I said, at first, the first inclusion were common law marriages, which, by the way, before this point were considered marriages. Now they're referred to discursively as common law marriages, but that was an effect of this transformation. It wasn't a sort of, it wasn't just always the case. And then even visiting relationships became gradually incorporated within this kind of umbrella of respectable heterosexual union. Now, as we get into the post-colonial period, there were a wave of feminist-inspired legal reforms in the 80s and 90s, reflecting global feminist politics, the movement for greater recognition of women's rights in the form of domestic violence laws, sexual offenses, provisions, and other family law reforms, of which much could be said. But the point here that I want to draw out is that all of these also further naturalize the notion of heterosexual pair bonding and reproductive conjugal relations as and nuclear family formations as in some cases in the legal text, as in fact it was explicitly formulated as the fundamental building block of society. Okay? In 1998, in Trinidad and Tobago, the Cohabitational Relationships Act further moved in this direction by expanding property rights and financial obligations analogous to marriage proper, applying only to heterosexual cohabitation. But in this case, I mean, that's pretty profound actually to expand and create property rights and financial obligations within what 50 years before would have been considered. Yeah, I mean, it was just like a moot point. So in this sense, this act too, by focusing on conjugal relationships that produce children, it again reaffirmed the centrality of heterosexual reproduction as kind of like the heart of the matter. And then the term cohabitant now has been mainstreamed in subsequent legislation and discourse, so that, for example, the amendments to the sexual offenses law in 2000 used the term cohabitant. That's just like a basic kind of key word in the discourse. What is relevant to mention here before I backtrack a little bit and focus on legislative changes and reforms having to do with homosexuality per se, Trinidad and Tobago has been a kind of role model in all of this, whether it's the domestic violence laws and all of these kinds of late 20th century, well, post-colonial, but especially the last couple of decades of legal changes and legislative reforms. Trinidad and Tobago's legal code has been a kind of role model in a sense, in that it's been like the first, and then the Bahamas follow suit, and all these other territories follow suit, and then their codes or their reforms use language and use as a source domain what happened here. And either tacitly through omission, or in some cases, or explicitly in others, all of these legislative reforms have excluded same-sex relations. So in that sense, it really has been a kind of heteronationalist effort. All right, so let me backtrack again to the colonial West Indian legal code. What mattered was the sex you had, whether it was procreative, in other words. Whereas by the late 20th century, the issue has increasingly become who you have sex with. And one of the effects of this has been a homosexualizing of the concept of buggery, which now most people think about as the same thing, right? That's how we define it. But in fact, again, this is an effect of these changes. It's not just been a sort of constant. And again, Trinidad and Tobago has been a leader. What I'm getting at is that the definition of buggery has been refined and focused, narrowed, focused, and homosexualized, and the